Hey, you sister students, hope you're doing well. Today we're going to be talking about part 2 of American imperialism, and so let's jump on in. First thing we're going to talk about is America in East Asia. Now, East Asia, if you remember, is going to be areas like China and Japan, and that kind of eastern side of Asia, so we'll get into that. Let's start with China. So, for a long time, China had been influenced, if you will, by European nations. They had gotten in and kind of fought for control of different parts of China, having different spheres of influences in different areas, which gave them special privileges. And the United States had traded with China for a long time, and the United States wanted to protect U.S. interests in the region. We wanted to be a part of all the great trade that was happening with China. And so the U.S. Secretary of State at the time, his name was John Hay, he created this policy that he called the open door policy. His goal was to try to request equal trading rights for all foreign nations to China, to try to cut back on some of this special privileges that these European nations had. And so he kind of creates this policy, sends it out to the European nations, and says that, hey, all nations should have equal trading rights in China. And most of the European nations agree and comply by the year 1900, and that really gives the U.S. A foot in the door into trade with China. Now, once John Hay, the Secretary of State, announces his open door policy, there are people in China that are known as the Boxers. And the Boxers in China do not like foreign groups controlling the country and having influence in the country. They want to try to get rid of all foreigners, get them out of the country. They want to control the government and really bring China back to what they call its greatness. And so this political cartoon, you can see these are all going to be European leaders, and they're all trying to take over. Here's Japan cutting up China, and back here is the Boxer, and he's saying, no, stop. He wants to get the Europeans and kick them out. Here's a Boxer, an actual photograph. So the European nations, the United States, didn't like this, that these Boxers were rebelling, trying to take over the government, because they knew if the Boxers succeeded, they would lose their influence in China. And so they created an international alliance to send troops into China, crush the rebellion, restore the original Chinese government so that the normal trade relations could resume and the European nations and the United States could have influence in China. Okay, we're going to jump into the Caribbean and see how the United States interacts with nations in the Caribbean. So you may be thinking, why does the United States want to have influence in the Caribbean region? Well, for one, it's very close to our back door. So for hemispheric security, the United States wants to be able to control the area, keep threats out. They don't want any threats taking safe haven in countries like Cuba or the Dominican or Haiti, etc., and being so close to our borders. And second, economic interests. Americans had businesses in the Caribbean. There are agricultural products in the Caribbean like sugar that is very lucrative, and so to help American businesses and American interests in the region, we want to be able to control and influence those governments and kind of keep our will imposed in that area. All right, if you remember back to the Spanish-American War that we recently talked about, it was fought on two fronts. It was fought in the Caribbean and it was fought in the Pacific. Now, this caused an issue for the U.S. Navy because they had to travel a long way to get from place to place. They had to travel all the way around the bottom tip of South America. And so going through the Spanish-American War, they realized that we need to have a canal. We need an easier way to move our Navy and our ships across the continent from East Coast to West Coast without having to travel so far. And so the idea of a canal really started to gain ground. There was a couple of places they thought about putting the canal, but they finally settled on an area that goes through present-day Panama. The issue was Panama was not a country at the time when this was being considered in the early 1900s. It was actually controlled by Colombia, and the U.S. tried to negotiate with Colombia to work out a deal to build the canal and have a little bit of control in the region, but Colombia wasn't as interested. They couldn't get a deal worked out. And so Teddy Roosevelt, the president at the time, had to try to think of something new to do. And he heard of and knew of a group of rebels in Colombia. They were Panamanian rebels. They wanted independence from Colombia. They wanted to create a country called Panama and have their own country, their own space. And so Roosevelt had this idea that if he could work out a deal with them, help them gain their independence, and in return they would give the United States some land to build a canal. So President Roosevelt sends a U.S. warship down, protects the Panamanian rebels fighting for independence, helps them win independence, and in return the Panamanians offer the United States a 10-mile strip through the country that the United States used to build the canal, and this was called the Panama Canal Zone. So you can see here Uncle Sam, you can see here the Panamanian nationalist, and here's got the canal plans in his hands, so helping him out, in return getting the canal built. Building the canal was not easy. They faced a lot of challenges, and it was a very large canal, 51-mile canal. It took 10 years to build, starting in 1903. Didn't end until 1914. A lot of people lost their lives. Thousands of people lost their lives. $400 million to build it, which is a lot of money, especially during the time period. And they had to work through several challenges, like different elevations. So to work through different elevations, they had to build a series of locks, where they're able to raise and lower water levels, raise and lower ships to move through different elevations. And then not only were the challenges of just constructing and engineering a canal this big and this extensive, but you also had the dangers to the workers, like working down there in the tropics in the intense heat in the middle of the day. They had to work through mountains, rainforest. There was heavy rain periods. You're right there on the equator, close to the equator. A lot more rains, tropical, the heat, all that. And all that leads to disease as well. Disease was a big problem. Yellow fever was a big problem. Malaria was a big problem. And in order to get rid of mosquitoes, the United States drained out swamps in the area. They cut down vegetation. They sprayed oil into standing water so that the mosquitoes couldn't breed in the standing water. So you have environmental damage and issues as well as human issues in building this canal. In order to exert control over the region, President Roosevelt, Teddy Roosevelt, used a doctrine that had been in effect since 1823. It was created by President Monroe. It's called the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine basically stated that European countries could not establish new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. The Monroe Doctrine is basically saying this hemisphere is going to be controlled by us. European powers, you need to kind of stay away. Now, Roosevelt, he tacked on something to the bottom, a corollary to the bottom of it. So it's like an addition. It's almost like TR is saying, here's the Monroe Doctrine, P.S., this also applies. The Roosevelt corollary stated that the United States would intervene in conflicts between European countries and countries in the Western Hemisphere. Basically saying that if you're having an issue with a country in Latin America, you're going to have to come through us as the mediator because we are in control of this hemisphere. You cannot independently come in here and take care of the issues. The United States will be in control. And so this was used throughout the time period to intervene in Latin American affairs, to help us get into Latin America and have a reason why we're able to work in Latin America. But a lot of Latin Americans resented this. They felt like the U.S. government was exerting too much control over them in the region. Now, TR, when he is no longer president, we have a new president, President Taft. President Taft continues to exert control in the Latin American and Caribbean regions. He uses a policy known as dollar diplomacy. And this is encouraging bankers to invest money into Latin America. That kind of gives the United States a reason to intervene in Latin American affairs because we have money invested there. So he uses this policy to promote American goals and objectives in Latin America and in the Caribbean. So if a Latin American country should fail to repay loans to American businesses, etc., the U.S. government would feel compelled to send in troops and make sure that money was paid. They were kind of like the police in a way, making sure that the Latin American countries are doing what they're supposed to do, American businesses are protected, etc. And so this gives America a large amount of control in the region. President Wilson, when he becomes president, he's our third progressive president, third president during this era. He is more of a moral character, moral president. He feels like the United States should not necessarily intervene in the affairs of these other countries. He's more of a black and white kind of guy. Although he does expand the U.S. empire by purchasing the Virgin Islands in 1917. But Wilson's time was mainly focused on Mexico because at the time, as Wilson comes in, Mexico is in the process of revolution. He did not like the new government. He did not recognize the new government as being a legitimate official government of Mexico. And he kind of adopts this policy that's known as watchful waiting. We're just going to wait it out. We're going to see what happens. We're not going to really take any action as of right now. We're going to just see what happens. But the problem is that there was this guy named Pancho Villa. Pancho Villa was leading raids into the United States, into areas of New Mexico, Arizona region. And he was coming in, raiding cities, raiding towns, murdering Americans. And so Wilson felt like he had to act. So he sends in this guy. His name is John J. Pershing. He sends him into Mexico with U.S. troops in order to try to catch Pancho Villa and bring him to justice. The American troops were never able to catch Villa because Wilson's attention and the U.S. attention got shifted towards Europe during this time because World War I is beginning to break out. And so U.S. troops and U.S. focus has shifted away from Mexico and shifted towards Europe.